So today's story, as you could so clearly tell, is set in the Jewish temple, which was, as most of you know, this immense structure. It was located in the capital city, in Jerusalem. And here's what's interesting about the temple. It represented not just the geographical heart of Jewish worship, it was also the spiritual heart of Jewish worship. During Jewish holy days, such as the feast day of the Passover, Jews from all over Judea and from Galilee and the surrounding regions would basically embark on this pilgrimage. And it's interesting because the population of Jerusalem for those couple of days would swell dramatically. But the temple was more than just a place for large, elaborate meetings of Jews from around the region. The temple, and this is really, really important to remember, was considered to be a kind of bridge between heaven and earth. It was, according to the Jewish mind, the way the Jews thought, the place where God's Spirit, His presence, dwelt in a very unique way. So, in a sense, the Jews believed that as they got closer to the temple, they were, in a sense, getting physically closer to God Himself. So this was a very, very important place. Well, in today's reading from John's Gospel, Jesus visits the temple during the time of the Passover, and He shows up with all of the other pilgrims. He shows up with all of the other tourists. However, even though Jesus is journeying with the crowds, He's not necessarily of the crowds, if you know what I mean. Because Jesus, as we all know, is special. Jesus is utterly unique. He's unique because He alone is bound in this eternal relationship of oneness with His Father. So when He walks through the gates of that temple in this story, He doesn't just enter as another worshiper. He doesn't just enter as another Jew. He enters as God's Son. He enters as God's Son going into His Father's house. And I think for that reason, He possesses a kind of freedom and an authority in this place that everybody else doesn't have, that everybody else lacks. And I'll offer you a bit of an illustration to convey what I'm trying to say here. So I want you to imagine that my parents were to host a party in their small home in Woodstock, and let's say they were to include guests from all over the neighborhood, guests from the street, and let's say that I was also invited to their party. Well, out of all the other guests attending the party, I, as my parents' son, would be able to kind of walk into that house with a special kind of freedom that your average guest wouldn't have. So, for example, I might be able to go into my parents' bedroom and find the phone and call Jasmine, for example, without asking their permission necessarily. Or I might even be able to open up the fridge and find some leftovers from the night before and pick away at it or something like that. If any other guests at the party were to do those kinds of things, if they were to take those liberties, it would seem intrusive, wouldn't it? It'd seem a bit creepy almost. But I possess these privileges because I'm my father's son, because I'm my mother's son. I possess this familial relationship, this close familial relationship with the owner of the house. And that's what it's like for Jesus to be in the temple in today's reading from John's Gospel. Because He is the Son of God the Father, He possesses this freedom and this authority that nobody else has, including the temple priests and including other religious authorities. They're just guests, in a manner of speaking, but He alone is God's Son. Now, imagine that while I was at the home of my parents, and I see that one of the guests is doing something they shouldn't be doing. Let's say, for example, they're ruining a piece of furniture in some way, shape, or form. Okay, I would have the right to be upset as the son of my parents. I would have the right to be able to go to that individual and say, hey, what are you doing? This is a vase that's been in my family for years, right? Well, in today's story from John's Gospel, Jesus walks into His Father's house, and what does He see? Well, He sees guests in His Father's temple essentially making a mess of the place. Listen to what it says in our reading. In the temple, Jesus found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers seated at their tables. I want to explain what's going on here. The temple was a place where animal sacrifices were offered to God. I think that much we all knew. Now, instead of having to bring animals to the temple in Jerusalem all the way from their hometowns, because you remember people had to travel, in some cases, quite a distance to get to Jerusalem, some pilgrims found it more convenient simply to buy the animals within the temple complex itself and offer these newly purchased animals to the priests. It was more convenient that way. And plus, it was an opportunity for some people to make a little bit of money. So merchants would rent out their stalls in the temple, they would sell animals to pilgrims, and they would make a bit of a profit on it. But then money changers also were established in the temple. And basically what they did was they allowed people to convert foreign currency into local currency. And they would then take this local currency and they would offer it in the temple. But in the process of doing the exchange thing, they would charge a small fee. So, what was the end result of all of this? Well, the end result is a place of worship that's no longer really a place of worship anymore. It was supposed to be a place of stillness, a place of beauty, a place of holiness, a place where you could draw into the presence of the living God, but it was turned into this, essentially a marketplace. Marketplaces can be noisy and very busy and cacophonous. That's what happened to the temple. And this angered Jesus because they were doing this to his Father's house. And in the story, we heard what Jesus does about all of this, and this is a famous story we're all familiar with. It says, making a whip of cords, Jesus drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins on the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. So what Jesus is doing here is really clear. As God's Son, he is pronouncing the Father's judgment upon corruption, the corruption of worship in the temple. And naturally, the Jewish religious authorities are scandalized by what Jesus did. So they ask him, perform some kind of a miracle that demonstrates to us that you actually have the God-given authority to do the outrageous thing that you just did. Jesus says, look, do you want proof? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. Now, at the time, that statement made absolutely no sense to anyone who was listening. But we, the readers of the story, are given insight into what Jesus truly means by that little editorial comment found in verse 21. Okay, it says, he was speaking not of the Jerusalem temple, but of the temple of his body. He was speaking of the temple of his body. And as soon as we're given this clue, we know exactly what Jesus is talking about. Jesus' body was indeed destroyed by the Jewish religious authorities, indeed by all sinful humanity, when he was nailed to the cross. And on the third day, true to what Jesus says in this passage, his body was raised again by the power of God. So only when this happens will people know that, yes, this man did in fact possess the God-given right to pronounce God's judgment on the people's corruption of worship in the temple. But there's even more going on here than you would think. I'd like to suggest that in saying these things, Jesus is offering a profoundly new and startling teaching about what it actually means to worship God. Notice that Jesus just compared himself, his body, to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, I want you to remember what I said earlier about the temple in Jerusalem. I said it was the heart of Jewish worship. I said it was the place where God's presence was believed to dwell in its fullness. What Jesus seems to be saying, if you read between the lines of today's story, is this. He's saying, I am the true temple. Because remember, Jesus is comparing his body with the temple in Jerusalem. He's saying, I actually am the true temple. I am the true house of God. The fullness of God dwells in me. I am the true meeting place between humanity and God. Therefore, all people, Jews and Gentiles, will flock to me in order to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So what the temple did in this flawed way, in this imperfect way, providing a kind of connection between humanity and God, Jesus now does fully and completely. Jesus and Jesus alone is the way to the Father. He is the one who bridges the great divide between humanity and God, the one who enables us, all people, to enter into the loving presence of God. So, in answer to the question that's posed to Jesus, what gives you the right to pronounce God's judgment on the way we worship? Jesus could have answered, I am the Son of God who enables the true worship of the Father. That's what gives me the right. Now, I think if Jesus had the right to pronounce God's judgment on the ways in which the Jews worshipped 2,000 years ago and what they were doing in the temple, then I think it's only fair that he has the right to pronounce God's judgment on the way in which we, as 21st century Christians, worship today. So there's a question I think that's worth posing here, and this is something I encourage you to wrestle with after this sermon is over as well. And the question I'm going to pose is this: have we, the Christians of today, allowed our worship to become in some way, shape, or form corrupt? Have we fallen into the same sort of sin that the Jews fell into 2,000 years ago by turning the Lord's house into a kind of marketplace, a place of chaos and confusion, instead of a place where all people could come and worship God? Now, before I answer that question, I have to answer a more foundational one. In the first place, why was Jesus so upset at the buying and selling that was taking place in the Jerusalem temple? Some have suggested that all the commercial activity within the temple prevented Gentiles, prevented non-Jews, from coming into the presence of God and worshiping. And here I ought to explain that all the buying and selling was taking place in a part of the temple that was called the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles was the one place in the entire temple complex where anyone from any nation could come and worship the Lord. If you wanted to kind of get into a further, like the further inner recesses of the temple, you definitely had to be Jewish. But the court of the Gentiles, anybody could go and worship the living God there. The problem is, they couldn't worship the Lord in this place because it had become a zoo, because it was this frenzy of activity, of buying and selling and changing money. So it's fair to ask, do we Christians do the same thing today? Do we, by our attitudes and customs and practices, by our church culture, make it hard for outsiders to become insiders? Are we trying to, in some way, shape, or form, keep people away from the temple who is Christ? That's a tough question to wrestle with. Do we as Christians do that? Do we make it hard for other people to come to Jesus? And I want you to reflect on that a little bit. I think some people have also suggested that Jesus was angry at all the buying and selling that was taking place in the temple because it mixed up the worship of God with the selfish pursuit of profit. And if that's the case, then I think it's pretty clear how 21st century Christians have fallen into the same trap as the Jews did 2,000 years ago with the temple. I have a friend named Tony. Some of you may know him. Years ago, he used to work at a Christian bookstore. And at this Christian store, they sold all sorts of stuff that my friend came to refer to as Jesus junk. So T-shirts with Christian slogans, keychains that said Jesus saves, Jesus coffee mugs, Jesus bumper stickers, Jesus bracelets, all kinds of trinkets and knickknacks that bore the name of our Lord on it. And you could make the argument that branding cheap goods with the name of Christ, cheap goods that could have been made in sweatshops for all we know, branding them with the name of the Lord to pursue profit, I think corrupts worship rather than enhances worship. It could be that we, the people of God, need to allow the Lord to cleanse us of some of that kind of profit motive, I guess you could say, that's attached to the name of Christ. And that, I think, could purify and renew our worship of the Father. So the point is this: there are 1,000,001 ways for us as sinful human beings to corrupt the true worship of the Lord. What we need to do is allow Jesus, as God's Son, to enter into our midst and purify all that hinders true worship, to cleanse us of all the things that corrupt our relationship with God the Father. That's why Jesus shows up in the temple on that particular day. He's there to cleanse worship. He's there to purify worship. He's there to purify God's house. He's there to purify the hearts of his people. And I think now, especially in the season of Lent, but throughout the year as well, throughout our Christian journey, we should allow Jesus to do just that. Invite him into our church. Invite him into your heart. Invite him into your mind. Invite him into your family. And ask him to purge, to get rid of anything that prevents us from truly worshiping God the Father the way God the Father wants to be worshipped.